we saw this kind of rumored around, and we wanted to get your thoughts on it. So critics say, obviously, you raised millions for your school, and after some time, about a decade or so, the school hasn't been up. So they want to know, what's the 2026 update on FDMG Academy?
First of all, anything a critic says about FDMG, I would like to know where they get their information from. Nobody knows how much money we raised because we never shared it.
Here I come. Oh, here I come. Oh.
Nobody knows how much money we raised because we never shared it. My circle is so tight that nobody in the public could know anything unless we share it with them. The only people we share information with are our donors. The big problem with the so-called FDMG controversy is the people asking the questions are not the donors.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Bruh, I had to replay this clip like 3 times, no joke, because at first it sounds like confidence, sounds like control. Then you catch the wording and it hits different. Dr. Umar Johnson didn't say he won. He didn't say he proved anything. He said nobody knows the real number. And once you understand how nonprofits actually work, that sentence stops sounding like a flex and starts sounding like a window cracking open. Not in the drama, in the patterns. Because this one sentence explains way more than this interview ever meant to.
Today your ass is gonna die, bitch. Say goodnight, motherfucker.
I want to start right here because this is where people messed up. That sentence didn't sound dangerous. That's the trick. Nobody knows the real number. Most folks heard confidence. I heard a door creak open. Because when someone says that casually, they're not arguing facts. They're signaling comfort with opacity. And anytime somebody's comfortable being vague inside a system that runs on disclosure, that's not accidental. That's a tell. This wasn't a slip like mispronouncing the name. This was a worldview leaking out. It's the mindset that says, I decide what matters, not the structure I'm inside of. And notice how smooth it sounded. No panic, no backtracking. That's not somebody realizing they said too much. That's somebody who said it before, just not on camera. That's why this moment matters. Not because of outrage, not because of legality yet, but because this is how power reveals itself. Quietly, when it thinks nobody's listening. Most exposés don't come from gotcha questions. They come from people talking freely. This was one of those moments. Here's where the psychology kicks in. Humans don't process content first. We process certainty. If somebody speaks like they're unbothered, most people assume they're unthreatened by the truth. That's why the tone mattered more than the words. He didn't sound defensive. He didn't sound cornered. So the brain goes,
what is he doing?
He's beginning to believe.
Oh, he's good then. That's charisma doing damage control without saying a word. Because confidence short-circuits skepticism. It always has. And let's be honest, a lot of people want to hear certainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Accountability is boring. So when someone sounds sure, we let them drive. But confidence doesn't mean correctness. It just means rehearsal. And when someone has rehearsed an answer long enough, it stops sounding like a dodge. It sounds like truth. That's why this hit different depending on the listener. If you already trusted him, you heard leadership. If you're neutral, you heard noise. If you understand systems, you heard friction. And friction is where stories really start. Let's slow this part down just enough to be clear. A nonprofit isn't just a label. It's a deal. You get tax exemption. You get credibility, you get moral authority, but you give up privacy around money. That's the trade. That's the part people love to skip. They talk like transparency is optional, like it's a vibe thing. It's not. It's structural. Once you step into that lane, the public has standing, not because they hate you, not because they donated, because the law says so. So when someone says, I only answer to donors,
Stupid.
That's not a boundary. That's a contradiction. You don't get to customize accountability. And this is where ego creeps in. People start thinking their mission overrides the rules, like intention somehow cancels obligation. But systems don't care about intent. Paperwork doesn't care about speeches.
I'm here to tell you right now, we don't care.
Let me tell you something.
We don't care.
And belief doesn't rewrite filings. That tension between personal authority and institutional rules, that's the real engine of this whole story.
There's a difference between privacy and secrecy.
and people pretend that line doesn't exist. Privacy is normal. Privacy is healthy. Secrecy inside a public structure, that's something else. When someone says my circle is tight, that sounds responsible. But inside a nonprofit, tight circles don't replace disclosure. They exist after disclosure. That's where the language starts doing gymnastics. Because now we don't share numbers isn't framed as avoidance, it's framed as discipline. But discipline with what standard? Your own? That's not how public trust works. Once money is raised under a public-facing tax-exempt umbrella, the circle widens whether you like it or not emotionally, structurally. So when secrecy gets defended as protection, I get skeptical. Because protection from what exactly? Questions, timelines, math. And notice how critics get reframed here. Not as people asking reasonable things, but as intruders. That framing isn't accidental. It creates a moral wall around the leader. That's the pivot point. When secrecy stops being about safety and starts being about control. This is where the internet gets it twisted. People think reputation outranks records. It doesn't. Paperwork doesn't care how many speeches you've given. It doesn't care how many followers you've inspired. It doesn't care how righteous your intentions sound. Forms are boring. That's why they're powerful. They strip the personality out of the story. And when someone says nobody knows the real number, what they're really saying is, don't confuse the paperwork with the truth. But here's the issue. In systems like this, the paperwork is the truth. Everything else is commentary. You can perform authenticity online all day. You can build myth, aura, presence. But filings don't bend to charisma. That's why this moment matters more than a rant or a clip. Because once persona and paperwork diverge, only one of them survives scrutiny. And history tells us it's never the persona. This part right here is textbook. I only answer to donors. That sounds principled until you think for 5 seconds. What that actually does is shrink accountability. It turns a public operation into a private loyalty test. Now, the question isn't, is this valid? It's, have you paid enough to speak? That's not governance. That's gatekeeping. And it works because it flatters supporters. It tells them, you're insiders. Everyone else is noise. But the real move, it weaponizes faith. Because once belief is tied to money, questioning feels like betrayal. That's why people defend things they'd roast anywhere else. Because walking it back would mean admitting they trusted the wrong structure.
You're showing me how unserious you are.
This tactic shows up everywhere. Churches, movements, online leaders. Shrink the circle, control the questions, protect the narrative. And once that happens, the truth doesn't disappear, it just gets delayed. Here's the part people don't like hearing. Finished projects end narratives. Unfinished ones keep them alive. When something is almost done, it's always in need of patience, always in need of grace, always one last push away. That's powerful, because almost there is emotionally profitable. Completion kills urgency. Delay sustains it. And notice how the story shifts over time. At first, it's optimism. Then it's obstacles. Then it's enemies. Years pass, but the framing stays fresh. Because the project never reaches a point where it can be judged cleanly. No ribbon cutting. No final accounting. No closure. An unfinished project lets you reset expectations endlessly. Every setback becomes proof of struggle. Every delay becomes evidence of opposition. And if someone asks, why is this still unfinished? They're not patient enough. They don't understand the vision. That's how unfinished turns into untouchable. Not because it's sacred, but because it's permanently pending. This is where language does heavy lifting. Divine timing sounds peaceful. It sounds wise. It sounds unarguable. And that's exactly why it works. Because how do you audit the divine? Once timelines get spiritualized, deadlines disappear. Missed targets aren't failures. They're destiny. And destiny never owes you an explanation. This move isn't about faith. It's about insulation. It wraps accountability in something you're not allowed to question. If you push back, you're not just critical. You're disrespectful. You're negative. You lack belief. And that's dangerous. Because systems need clocks. They need benchmarks. They need receipts. The moment it'll happen when it's meant to replace is here's the timeline. You're no longer tracking progress. You're tracking faith. And faith is powerful, but it's terrible for audits. Pay attention to who becomes the villain and win. It's never random. Critics, cities, contractors, systems. Every external force becomes hostile right as scrutiny increases. That's not coincidence. That's narrative defense. Because once there's an enemy, questions feel like attack. And attacks don't deserve answers, they deserve resistance. This is how leaders flip the pressure. Instead of explaining, they mobilize. Instead of clarifying, they rally. Now the audience isn't listening, they're guarding, protecting, defending. And the wild part, enemies don't even have to be real. They just have to be believable. Once that switch flips, facts don't disappear. They just get drowned out by noise, loyalty, and conflict. And that's how stories stay messy on purpose. When everyone around you is the problem, that's not bad luck. That's a signal. Cities are corrupt. Contractors are lazy. Critics are haters. At some point, the math stops mathing because patterns don't form randomly. Blame inflation happens when explanations start running out. You need more villains to hold the structure together. One enemy isn't enough anymore. And notice how blame gets broader over time. It starts specific, then it gets abstract, then it gets systemic. Now it's not one contractor, it's all contractors. Not one city issue, it's the system. That move does two things at once. It protects the leader and it exhausts the audience. Because when everything is broken, nothing can be fixed. And if nothing can be fixed, nobody can be held responsible. That's the quiet genius of blame inflation. It turns accountability into background noise. This is where ego fills the gaps. I can bring millions. I've got the people. I'll shut the city down. Big numbers sound like power, but real power doesn't need to shout. When receipts get thin, rhetoric gets loud. That's not coincidence. That's compensation. Because large claims do psychological work, overwhelm doubt. They intimidate critics. They energize believers. But here's the thing. Numbers you can't verify don't protect you. They expose you, especially when they replace paperwork. And notice who those claims are for. Not regulators, not inspectors. The audience. It's theater. A performance of dominance meant to make questions feel small. The louder the flex, the more carefully you should look at what is trying to drown out. This is the hardest part to accept. The audience split isn't about facts. It's about identity. Some people didn't just donate money. They donated belief. And belief doesn't refund easily. Once you've defended something publicly, backing off feels like self-betrayal. So the brain does what it always does. It rationalizes. Now contradictions aren't problems. They're tests of loyalty. That's why two people can watch the same clip and hear opposite things. One hears exposure, the other hears persecution. And the longer this goes on, the harder it is to exit. Because leaving would mean admitting you ignored signs you'd call out anywhere else. That's not stupidity. That's human nature under pressure. And once you see that, the split stops being confusing. It becomes predictable. Once you zoom out, this story stops being about one man. It becomes a template, charismatic leader, big mission, emotional audience, early momentum, loose structure.
A bullshit? And you know what though? That's typically how the bullshit goes. You feel me?
Money starts flowing faster than systems. Then comes the pivot. Questions turn into disrespect. Transparency turns into betrayal. Rules become oppression. Deadlines become spiritual warfare. Critics become enemies of the cause. I've seen this arc in churches. I've seen it in movements. I've seen it in online creators who start believing their own mythology. The moment someone believes the mission exempts them from structure, everything starts bending. Numbers, narratives, timelines. Not because they're evil, because power without friction distorts judgment. That's the pattern people pretend not to see. And once you see it here, you'll see it everywhere. This isn't about picking sides. It's about understanding how power actually behaves when nobody's checking it. Every system needs friction. Every movement needs guardrails. And every leader needs limits, especially the ones who swear they don't. When belief replaces verification and loyalty replaces structure, confusion isn't a bug, it's the product. So here's my question for you. When the paperwork and the story don't match, which one do you trust? And if you really want to go deeper, there's an almost 3-hour deep dive I did on Dr. Umar, breaking down the school, the money trail, the filings, the contradictions, just receipts and patterns stacked on top of each other. I'll link it on the screen. Watch it when you're ready, because once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. I'll see you on the next one.
Panda.
Panda out.